Interpretation for Texas Master Naturalists, telling meaningful stories to enable understanding. We begin by taking a look at what is interpretation, but we begin by taking a look at what it is not. Interpretation is not interpret data. Within interpret data, we're just worried about communicating facts. Facts, figures, a description of the topic that we're covering, and that's it. Now, facts are important to our story, but by themselves, it's not enough. And if we only deliver facts and figures and descriptions to an audience, they tend to leave with this feeling or wonderment of, well, so what? Interpretation is also not interpropaganda. This is a play on words of the term propaganda. Within interpropaganda, we seek to influence the beliefs of our audience. And we do so in such a way that we ignore any conflicting points of view, because in our story, we want to head towards a conclusion we've already created. And thus, we discourage any dialogue. This is interpropaganda. Interpretation is also not interpretainment. Within interpretainment, we stereotype multiple viewpoints. Consider a spider, a bat, a snake. They're the evil character in the story. That's interpretainment. They also oversimplify the facts. They really don't want to tell the whole story. And the facts they do provide are arranged around a storyline. And in honesty, within the field of entertainment, they assume the audience really isn't interested in the resource, the topic. This is interpretainment. So then what is interpretation? Let's start with the story. Our house on the, the east side of the house is this wooded area that's part of the National Wildlife corridors. And it's not quite a thorn scrub, but it's definitely much more of a wooded area than in our empty backyard. Well, within this area, there's a brush, it's pretty thick, and you have these sometimes dead trees that are just leaning over, and they're just sort of barely hanging on. Well, I was worried. Here is this old tree that is about to fall over, hurting me, hurting my family, hurting my property. To be honest, it was a nuisance. It didn't look that great. So I needed to basically take it down, cut it down safely so that it wouldn't hurt anything. Well, one day I saw this. And this was before I was a Texas Master Naturalist, but even then I kind of knew, hey, that kind of looks like a woodpecker. I've seen the cartoons, Woody Woodpecker and stuff. This guy looks like a woodpecker. So I went out and I looked him up. I looked him up through Google and I discovered he was a golden-fronted woodpecker. Native mostly to Mexico, Central America, and definitely a local resident within the RGV. And he seemed to keep coming back to this dead tree. Well, guess what? This woodpecker was basically going to have to find another tree to go and take a look at and look for bugs. That is until I saw that this was more than just a tree. This was its home. And out one day poked out the little head of its baby. And he was almost looking at me with the chainsaw in my hand, wondering what was I going to do with this chainsaw. And I got to say, this changed my mind. Here, this mother was trying to provide for its baby. Or it could have been the dad, I wasn't sure, but this was a home. And whether they were successful at raising their young now fell upon my shoulders. And I thought to myself, this is true for all of us here. Our choices and our decisions can dictate whether some of these species survive. And I did leave this tree there. And though the tree has fallen on its own, it didn't hurt anybody, The baby we saw had already left its nest. And though we can't really tell which is the adult and which is the baby, I know they still live in this area because I hear him pounding on another dead tree somewhere within this wooded area. So back to this question about what is interpretation. Interpretation, the formal definition of interpretation, is a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meaning inherent in the resource. So, my interpretation to you, my story to you, had a mission based on the fact that I am a Texas Master Naturalist. I live in the RGV, and I created it in such a way to make it a story that kind of pulled at your emotions a little, and yet provided you something to think about from an intellectual perspective. Now, I know that you are future Texas Master Naturalist, and that shaped my story. And I brought out this inherent meaning of these birds, the tree, the ecosystem, and our role in the success or failure of this ecosystem. So this is an example that I wanted to share with you on this idea about what is interpretation. So what does interpretation look like? Well, there's two kinds, the non-personal versus personal. And as you can imagine, the non-personal piece takes the form of anything where the person is not face-to-face with his or her audience. We're talking about brochures, exhibits, signs, and audiovisual presentations, perhaps just like this video, social media, podcasts, and even video blogs. And within our chapter, we do some of those things from our YouTube channel now that we're trying to provide our videos, our newsletter that we've been doing for quite a while. We adapted to social media, so we got our Facebook presence. These are non-personal interpretation, very challenging to do, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is, but very effective nonetheless. The other form of interpretation is personal interpretation. And as you might guess, this is the one person interpreting to one or more. Now, I've been asked in the past, well, this says one person interpreting to one person or more. Could it be more than one person interpreting to a group? And yes, it can. But that takes a lot of coordination between the pair that is doing the interpreting. You don't want to ruin your story or your message because one or the other person isn't in sync with the storyline. And it takes some practice, but it can be done. But personal interpretation is this face-to-face interaction with others. Now, it is the most powerful means of interpreting. Why? Because we get to know the audience. I get to know and I understand that you are Texas Master Naturalist trainees. So getting to know who your audience will structure what your story looks like. Plus, you can adapt to your audience. If you're speaking to a group, you can key off of what they say, what they are doing, the facial expressions to help you tailor the story as you're giving it. Something very difficult to do when you're not face to face. Now, in the end, it depends on the skills of the interpreter. Have they practiced it? Have they rehearsed it? Have they done this story over and over again so that they can deliver it well? And I add that it also depends on the mood of the interpreter. Imagine if your heart wasn't in it that day, your audience will actually pick up on that. You have to be fully engaged in your topic, being wanting to talk about it, being excited to talk about it. And that the audience will sort of feed on. And that adds a lot to your storytelling. Now, there are 6 basic principles that we go over when talking about interpretation. The first principle is that you want to relate what you are showing or demonstrating to the audience. And you want to make that connection with your audience so that they are hooked to your storyline. So let's say, for example, you're given a birding tour and you have a hummingbird feeder and there's a group of hummingbirds flying around. Now, one way to take this story is that, well, these are birds and they're taking advantage of a hummingbird feeder to eat. But if you pose this to your audience as something like, well, don't we all enjoy a rest stop when we're traveling across Texas? All of a sudden, your audience relates to that and says, okay, tell me more. And then you're able to explain that these little birds, so small, are migrating thousands of miles, and we get a chance to help them by providing them a little rest stop. So if you can make that connection with your audience in terms that they can understand, they key in on your story. And that's what we want to do. We want to relate it to the audience. Principle number 2, the information is not interpretation. We cannot just simply regurgitate facts that we know. I could tell you that these parasitoid wasps are a large group of Hymenopteran superfamilies with all the wood wasp being in the wasp. I can regurgitate a bunch of things about this little wasp. And that could be interesting. But then again, your audience is left with, so what? Now imagine you tell your audience, this parasitoid wasp lays their eggs on or in the bodies of a paralyzed arthropod. What do you think is going to happen to the spider? This creates a completely different dialogue. You can imagine your audience saying, it does what? You mean the spider's still alive? And the thing is planting a baby inside of it? This creates quite a different story, and you're still having the opportunity to share facts and figures and information about this live battle between species. The information by itself is not enough. Principle number 3, interpretation is an art which can utilize many arts. And in such, we can practice it and make better. If you have ever gone to the Palo Alto battlefield when they do their reenactment, it's an amazing thing to see. They have an opportunity to dress the part and act the part. And that is a great way to capture your audience and tell your story. Principle number 4, the chief aim is provocation. Now, don't think provocation means you're trying to promote a fight or an argument or a discussion. That's not the definition we want to focus on. We want to leave people with more questions than answers after the presentation. We want people to think deeply about meanings. Now, I'll give you an example of Benito, who has a ranch up in Rio Grande City. And if you've been fortunate enough to go on a field trip to go visit his ranch, you leave your air-conditioned car to walk into his property, and right away you look at Benito, and he looks the part. You go into this ranch out in the middle of nowhere, and he looks like a rancher. And when you go on his tour, he's telling you about the history of the ranch, the things that he's learned, the things that he does. And he will take the time to pull a leaf off of a Spanish dagger, a yucca. And as he's doing his thing, taking this and that out of the yucca, he's telling a story about how the early inhabitants of this region used to waste nothing. And as he's talking, he's pulling out the little threads, he's pulling out the thorn, he's pulling out all these parts and pieces of how early inhabitants used the yucca plant. One plant out of hundreds that are on his property. And at the end of the day, you're getting back into your air-conditioned car, going out to pick up food at a drive-through, but you're left wondering, man, that was way different back then. What it took to survive back then was incredible. And you're left wondering, man, would I have done that had I lived at that time? That's what we mean by provocation. We're leaving people wondering and thinking about the message you gave them. Principle number 5, aim to present a whole rather than a part. When we take a look at some of the sea turtle releases, for example, it isn't just a story about this little turtle that gets to go back to the ocean. There's a lot more to that. And we want to make sure that we paint that entire story for your audience. Ask them to think about what are the dangers that this little turtle faces once it's back in the open water. But not just from predators, but from things we have done. And they begin to wonder, well, you see these boats flying by the water. You think the turtle can get out of the way fast enough? We've seen all the trash that's out in the ocean that washes up on shore. Do you think the turtle runs into any of it? And when these turtles are coming up to the beach to lay their eggs, do you think they're going to be able to get out of the way of your four-wheel drive going down the beach at 30 miles an hour? We do want to paint the whole story rather than just this single event. The sixth principle is that our presentations to children should not be watered down versions of the presentation we give to an adult. We need to think of it, we almost need to begin with a complete blank sheet of paper when we approach kids. Barbara and I used to give tours, or we do every so often give tours at a ranch nearby over the summer when they have summer camps. And one of the things that we learned is that to engage the children and to engage these kids, it can be as easy as picking up a beetle that we see walking across our trail. And we show this to our kids and we start talking about it. And sometimes we don't even talk. They start asking questions. Why are his antennae so long? And we start asking, well, it kind of looks like a longhorn, doesn't it? Yes, it does. Guess what? It's called the longhorn beetle. And then we talk about his little mouth parts, the fact that they move side by side compared to up and down like their mouths do. And these young kids that we talk to become engaged with our story. Something we don't necessarily would do with adults, but we tailor our storyline completely different when we're dealing with children. And that's an important principle for us to consider. Now then, how do we interpret? We have an idea of what interpretation is and what it's not. We understand, hopefully, the principles of what it takes for interpretation to be effective. But then how do we actually do it? We have an acronym that will help us remember that, and that's poetry. Interpretation has to have a purpose. And that purpose for us ties back to our mission as Texas Master Naturalists in the RGV. And if you haven't read our mission before, or maybe you glanced at it, but our mission is to develop a group of knowledgeable volunteers to provide education, outreach, and service dedicated to the study and conservation of natural resources and natural areas within the RGV. This gives us our purpose. Now, not all parts and pieces will fit into every story that we give, but this gives our interpretation a purpose. Now, interpretation is also organized. To be effective, we want to deliver a good story. And just like writing in your English class when you were in school, they told you, hey, you need an introductory paragraph, then the body of your story, and then a conclusion. Keep that in mind when you create your interpretation. This flow of your story is very important. And also remember the rule of 7 plus or minus 2. 7 plus or minus 2. This is for you to remember that most of your audience will remember between 5 to 9 things. You may talk for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it might be, but at the end of the day, your audience will remember 5 to 9 things. And so think to yourself, what are the most important things I want them to remember, and keep bringing it up in your story, because those are the things that you want them to walk away. Interpretation should also be enjoyable. Why? Well, it adds value to the guest's experience. They want to enjoy their time with you. And this also, making it fun, keeps them engaged with you. You want them to stay for your entire story. And making your story enjoyable becomes really important. Interpretation should be thematic. By thematic, or this concept of a theme, it provides the main point for your story. This is critical. It invites the audience to think deeply about the topic that you're presenting or describing or showing. So interpretation is thematic. Now, interpretation is relevant as well. And to make it relevant, you need to consider two things. The first one is meaningful. Your audience can relate to what is being said and understand it. That understanding is really, really important. You can be talking about something, and if they don't understand it, it just goes in one ear, not the other. So relate it back to them in some shape or form so that they can make it meaningful. Now, interpretation, to make it relevant, it should be meaningful and it should be personal. The audience cares about what is being presented. You want to make it personal. I told a story about this tree that could hurt me, my family, my property, my home, and so on. They can relate to that. But then you bring it back to something like, well, what would you do? Because they can see themselves in that same situation. You want to make it meaningful, you want to make it personal, something that they can care about. Now, with my audience, you being my audience, I know you would find my story meaningful just simply because you want to be a Texas Master Naturalist. That helped me. So by knowing my audience, it helped me make my story relevant. Now, the last part of this acronym poetry, the why, is you. It requires you. And you want to be able to adapt to your audience by watching and listening and getting to know who they are. And you need to practice your skills to keep them sharp. This ability to present in front of a group, what is it? What people call it, one of their greatest fears is this public presentation. But one way to get over that is to practice. There's no other way to get over your fear of public presentations than practice. Now, I wanted to come back to my original story to sort of help you sort of piece this thing together. And so when I looked at purposefulness and our definition of interpretation, I thought to myself, I want to make this a personal experience, something that happened to us. And I want the audience to consider how your actions can help or harm our environment. This ties in our mission, which is our chapter's mission as part of TMN. And I know, again, the fact that you're a Texas Master Naturalist, this would be something that falls within your realm of interest. So I wanted this story to have a purpose that meant something to you. I also tried to make sure that it was organized. My story begins with this tree, that it could hurt me. I needed to do something about it, to the discovery of the woodpecker and the discovery of the family, this woodpecker family. And this brought in a process of delivering my communication message to you. I tried to pull some emotional aspects by talking about this bird's family and the fact that I might hurt them. And there's a lot to the meaning about this woodpecker, this tree, and the environment as a whole. The ecosystem of our valley becomes a part of my story. Hopefully I made this enjoyable. I shared my kind of early ignorance of not knowing exactly what this bird is, what it does, how it, the fact that it makes its home inside a hole. I kind of knew it in the back of my head, but I got to admit, I didn't really know it until I started to look up more information about it. And so this journey was something that I hopefully was able to convey to you and added the value to the much larger picture of the environment in our valley. I tried to create a theme. Hopefully you were wondering, surely he's not going to cut this tree down, right? I mean, well, first of all, will he cut it to, is this story about somebody getting hurt? But then wait a minute, there's a woodpecker and his family. He's not going to hurt the baby, right? This isn't going to be a story about how I did something bad. So this was my theme to help deliver my story to you. When I think about relevance, we all, as just humans living in this region, choose what we plant, what we want to cut down, whether to mow all the flowers and what we call weeds down, whether to use pesticides. This becomes a big issue that we are all part of. And the decisions we make can actually define whether we can preserve some of our environment or not. And so I tried to make this or ensure that my story was relevant to all of us. And when we come down to the you, again, I picked an experience that I'm well versed with because I was there. And it also questioned my definition of what was supposed to be a, a good looking yard. That whole idea about it should be, perfectly manicured, kind of goes out the window when you have this ugly, what was it originally I thought was an ugly dead tree just there. But there was a lot to that. And I took the National Association of Interpretation training because I wanted to be able to tell a story better. Like I said, the best way to do some of this is by practicing and practicing and practicing. And I did go through the certification process just to help me get better. And that's what I tried to bring into my story for you. There's a lot of resources when it comes to interpretation. The sort of the main character that you see in a lot of these, that center book, Interpreting Our Heritage by Freeman Tilden. Tilden is credited not so much that he came up with this idea about interpretation, but he was one of the first ones to help sort of define a structure by creating the 6 principles. And all the other authors have built up their own and expanded on his original ideas to make them their own. All great resources to try to help us improve this challenge of being interpreters. One last thought I'll leave you with. Through interpretation, understanding. Through understanding, appreciation. Through appreciation, protection. The best that we can hope to do as Texas Master Naturalists, as interpreters, is to help your audience achieve understanding. And as they think and ponder the meaning of what you shared with them, they will develop an appreciation for it. And if there is something that you appreciate, you will seek to protect it. That's our goal.